Eric.
Omar.
This is it.
This is it.
This is the one. I cannot believe the audacity that you have, Eric.
Well, you know what? I didn't start the fire.
Yeah.
It was always burning. Not since the world was turning, but at least since Sandow said, you know, what I want to do is I want to create a great competition in London and figure out who is England's most hunkiest hunk.
Thank you.
Exactly.
Eric, real quick, were you quoting Billy Joel at the start there? Yay or nay? Or was that close? We didn't start the fire? Yeah, it was.
100%. Yeah,
Adrian,
absolutely.
So let me we're going to start including the guests in the introduction. Adrian, let me ask you a question. I always find this intriguing to me. The cultural exports of various countries where we made the reference that live and Budokan, like Cheap Trick, is huge in Japan. Disproportionately so compared to in America. Some artists have global appeal. Question for you. Billy Joel, because he kind of strikes me as being a pretty American artist. I don't know how popular he is. Germany, Berlin. Is he anything? Is he irrelevant? What is he?
I remember a lot of car rides with my parents where he was playing on the radio again and again. And if you have like a 6-hour drive and you hear the same song like 5 times or something. So I think it's big in the German radio at least.
Dang. Okay. And then because I also heard, and I'm not trying to mischaracterize anything, but is it true? And I don't know why this is relevant right here, but it made me think of it. David Hasselhoff, Eric, had a minor musical career in Germany. I heard.
I think Hassel the Hoff is his rap name.
Hassling the Hoff. But no,
that's not a joke, by the way.
What?
That's not a joke.
I thought Eric has always thought he's just cracking a joke.
I know, no, it sounds ridiculous, but I am actually pretty sure that David Hasselhoff did do some rapping, and
the fact that internet hasn't dug that up and memed the hell out of it. Come on, guys. Now we're going soft on the intro here, just because alert, signal, noises, flashes. Seizure warning, Brandon, thank you. This is a monster episode. This is going to be a personal favorite. I said Audacity, it's not the audio editing program, but I said of you, Eric, but then I was corrected off air that in this philosophical paper on bodybuilding, whether or not it's a sport, there's a reference in there to the seminal bodybuilding documentary, Pumping Iron. Folks, this is it right here. Pumping Iron has made it into a philosophy paper. I couldn't believe it. I was reading the whole argument. This is a strong argument. So on a pumping iron. What the hell? Arnold Schwarzenegger ballet posing? Whoa!
Yep, and I can't even take credit for that one. That was actually Adrian's idea to demonstrate it, and it is an iconic demonstration of what we're going to get into.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know what the heck Omar's talking about, to give you some background, I actually had the unique experience of being asked to do something just barely within my field of academia. And that is because I'm a physique sports scientist, but I primarily land in the quantitative realms. And even when I fall in the space of qualitative research, it's still, related to something quantitative. I typically do mixed methods work, interviewing athletes or coaches or something like that. So we have a PhD candidate, Adrian Kind, on here today. And he shot me an email and said, "Hey, did you know about this paper, which just, shocked and appalled me, that in 2018, the good Dr. Aranyosi published a paper arguing that bodybuilding is not a sport. And it is a philosophy paper, and Adrian's going to give us a little more background into the actual field of philosophy, where he makes a case, he makes a categorical argument, and he also describes a spectrum by which, with those criteria, you would judge bodybuilding to be more of an art-like performance than a sport." And he said, I don't actually agree with his characterization, being, Adrian, would you call yourself a fan of bodybuilding?
All the time, yeah.
My man. So as a fan of bodybuilding and as someone he's part of the cult, folks, Adrian lifts. The question is, does he even lift? And that is a philosophical question, and the answer is absolutely yes. So anyway, Adrian said, "Hey, but I would appreciate your collaboration on this, because you are not only a bodybuilding coach and competitor, but you also understand the physiological demands and the structure of the sport to a degree I can't. And I said, yo, I don't know nothing about. It's like, it's philosophy, all right. I know I have a PhD. Technically, that means I have a doctorate in philosophy, but I know how to argue on Reddit. I do not know how to argue in a paper. So we combined powers. We were the odd couple, and we just recently submitted for publication as well as preprint. We may find out that it's terrible and we'll get rejected all over the place, but we at least made it into peer review. So that's a good sign. We cleared the first, desk rejection hurdle. But Adrian Kind, welcome to Iron Culture. You are a PhD candidate at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain under the broad umbrella of philosophy of science, and specifically in the philosophy of psychiatry. So I think first thing for the cult would be if you could please kind of give us more of an introduction on yourself, your background, and what your field of study is all about.
Yeah, sure, of course. So, where do you want me to start? Just my university career, or the first time I ever took up a barbell and thought about the meaning of lifting?
You know what? If you want to start there, I'm gonna stop you, brother.
Yeah, okay. So, when I started to come up with a good story of why I wanted to write this paper, there obviously was no super cool story, and I thought to reconstruct something from my past. And indeed, I remember that the first time I went to a library with school when I was a teenager, our task was to find a book and then present it to the rest of the class. And I picked a philosophy book. It was like secondary literature on Plato. And I read a passage where he described the whole purpose of education, and that how crucial it is that the good Greek is educated or educates his mind as well as his body. And I think you can fast forward. I'm writing an email to write this paper. So that's the long and short. And when it comes to what I do in university, I first study psychology. So I'm also a clinical psychologist, and I'm currently doing my training as a psychotherapist, which takes quite a while here in Germany. And when I finished my studies in psychology, I actually figured out that rather than looking more into the empirical details or collecting data and stuff, I was more interested into methodological questions, meta questions. What is it actually, what we measure? What does it mean to measure a personality trait? What is a mental disorder? And so on and so on. And all these are more meta questions, you might say, or philosophical questions that science itself usually does not address, right? So I started to study philosophy, finished my philosophy studies, and now I'm in a PhD program, having a lot of fun and a good time with my supervisors and colleagues. And now I'm working on the question, so if we think of psychiatric diagnostics, how does it actually work? Like, how do psychiatrists arrive at their diagnostic judgments? What's the method behind clinical judgments? And what exactly is the kind of justification they can provide? Is it induction? Is it deduction? Is there an inference to the best explanation? So what is going up in the background, why we should trust psychiatrists or maybe don't trust them?
I think that's really useful and interesting background information. And just to kind of give people a really layman's understanding of the difference between different fields to some degree, the way you measure a 100-meter sprint, for example, has changed because technology's gotten better, but it's essentially unchanged. The method, the behind it, the methodology, I should say. The methods have changed. The actual tools of the measurement have gotten more precise, but the methodology has been the same since forever, since we could, do races. However, like the DSM, it's on its 5.3 iteration or whatever it is. And in quantitative research, if you can quantify something, you can do quantitative research on it. But when you use personality traits, like when I do something like a common one would be POMS, the profile of mood states, or the DALDA, the daily analysis of life demands for athletes. You get a score, you see if it gets worse or better. But really, what are you measuring? When a person says, I feel better than normal, there's a lot baked into that question. And you have to actually validate these questionnaires, see if they are correlated to one another, and you have to acknowledge that simply by asking a human being a question, you're influencing their answer. And that is not necessarily true of some of the sports science measurements we have. So these kind of big picture questions about the nature of the information we're getting and the decisions we're making is really interesting. And I think it has value. I think sometimes people don't necessarily understand what people in philosophy do, but ultimately, and we won't get into this maybe until later in the podcast, philosophy is the basis of science. Reasoning and logic informs our ability to make good study designs and make the correct, or at least not extend beyond the inferences we could make in any given piece of research, and then interpret it in a way that doesn't extend beyond the limitations of the study. And a lot of the times errors get made in those areas specifically because I think too many scientists are a little weak in their underlying philosophy of science, if you will. So I'll leave it there, and let's talk about the present paper, where we decided to put on the boxing gloves and get in the argumentation ring with Aranyosi, who probably doesn't know this paper's out, does not know he's in a ring, and does not know that three of us are going to be punching him together. So it's definitely a fair fight. No, but in all seriousness, I think it would be good to get an idea from you. Like, when you saw this paper, what did you think about it?
Yeah.
And what made you want to write a rebuttal to it?
So my motivation was twofold, I would say. On the first side, I wanted to do something that has nothing to do with my dissertation. I needed to do something else, but I felt so guilty for doing this that I said, okay, I have to do something that is productive, but not what I should do actually right now, which is writing my dissertation. So I thought, okay, let's write a philosophy paper about something that is actually not in my ballpark at all. And I thought about what other kind of stuff was on my mind for a lot of time right now. And in the end, I was like, okay, actually it's bodybuilding, because in the last years I've hurt myself a lot when I trained, and then I started to think, okay, Adrian, you're rather scientific about a lot of parts of your life. Maybe you should also start to read something about training instead of just like watching YouTube videos of guys doing muscle ups and then like break your elbow by trying it yourself. Maybe there is something like a progression to learn stuff, or And so I also ended up like listening to your podcast and more other content. I was like, man, has ever anybody written anything about like philosophy and bodybuilding? It seems so like Greek in a way that somebody must have had an idea about this kind of thing. It was kind of disappointing that I didn't find anything very serious. But then I dug up this Aranyosi paper, 2018, read it, and I thought, I think he's wrong, but in an interesting way. So, yeah, I can do something about it. And who would I like to do something with about this? Who's like the thick-necked, pumping bro and a brain at the same time? And I thought, yeah, why don't I drop Eric Helms an email? Probabilities he will answer is probably low, but at least I tried.
Yo, if there's one guaranteed way to get me to respond to an email, and the spammers are going to latch onto this immediately, it's tell me that you want to write a philosophy paper on bodybuilding. And I might say no, but I'm going to say something. You know what I'm saying? So now that's awesome.
A question for you, Adrian. Was the subject something like saving the sanctity of bodybuilding? Like, what did you get to appeal to Eric's good senses where just the bat signal went off and he's like, I'm in? Because I know Eric's a busy man. I actually do think I've seen him in the comments or whatnot. He will respond. But what was the approach? It's like, hey, would you like to contribute, collaborate on this? I'm thinking about this. Or was it definitive? You'd already made your mind. You're looking for your dance partner, your Lindy Hop partner. And it was like Eric was the first choice. Was he the only choice? My question I was going to say, or did you even start thinking of backups, Adrian, where you're like, well, I do want someone that has a background in this and so on and so forth? Or was Eric the only dance partner?
So Eric was the only person I wrote to. And I think what my fantasy is what got him was not actually the text in the email, but perhaps the subject line, which was, I think it was all caps, iron and philosophy. So I thought that would be catchy enough to at least open the email.
It nailed it, bro. He nailed
it. It worked.
No.
And I'm so glad that what we said off air that Dr. Mike Israetel was your first choice and he didn't respond and was left out of this podcast. So Brandon, you can cut that out.
Yeah.
No. So this is pretty cool. So what I think might be helpful is if we start with the Aranyosi paper from 2018. If you can walk us through that and essentially what the argument was in that paper.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Let me do that. So the Aranyosi 2008 paper basically says that, or looks at bodybuilding as a physical sport. Aranyosi is only concerned with the idea of physical sports in his paper. He doesn't want to talk about like chess, for example, or discuss whether chess is a sport or esports, as computer games are called today, are actually sports or not, right? He's just focusing on physical sports. And he basically provides two arguments against bodybuilding being a sport. The one that we call the categorical argument, and the other one, which is what we call the spectrum argument. The categorical argument basically works on the way that he says, look, we don't have like in philosophy of sport, we don't have like a full-fledged definition of sports, which has like necessary and sufficient condition that need to be fulfilled for something to be a sport. But we have a couple of necessary conditions, at least, where we say, well, this kind of things should be present in something if we call it a sport. Then he lists these conditions and says, oh, bodybuilding is not meeting all these conditions, therefore it's not sport. So that is the basic strategy of his first argument. The second argument is a little bit more tricky, but also interesting, I think, because in the second argument he says, well, actually we shouldn't think categorically about this matter, but we should rather say there's something like a spectrum between, on the one hand, sport and at least one other thing, namely art. So an art-sport spectrum. And there may be something sporty about bodybuilding, but it definitely is way closer to the art side of the spectrum. So when we talk about bodybuilding, we should talk about it more as an art form, a sort of like performance and presentations, rather than sport. So that is a basic approach.
Yeah, and I think we've all read that paper, and I liked the paper. I have to say, I found it an intriguing read. I wasn't distracted. It was interesting to get the perspective of someone who is, I'm assuming not a competitive bodybuilder and maybe just a casual fan. I really don't know. So that could be completely wrong. And then writing about it. And in his paper, Body, Skill, and Look, Is Bodybuilding a Sport? In the Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences. One thing that we kind of wrestled with was how he presents the two arguments. Because would you say, Adrian, that he doesn't actually intend to present them as two arguments, but more so that the spectrum is in support of his first point, that it doesn't meet the necessary conditions for sport as outlined by prior philosophers of sport?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure about this point. I mean, we talked about it, and I think there's two ways to read his paper and how these arguments relate. One way, and then there would be a problem, I would say, is that he says bodybuilding is not a sport because we should think about this in a categorical manner, but we should also think about it on the spectrum manner, and then we cannot make categorical judgments. That's weird. Like you cannot like eat the pudding and nail it to the wall. However, this English thing, because I have no idea.
That's definitely the English saying.
No, that is from henceforth will be the saying because I prefer it vastly.
I'm never going to say have my cake and eat it too. I want to either eat the pudding or nail it to the wall. This is great.
Okay, so either you can make the categorical argument or you can make the spectrum argument. This is one way to read my thing. And the other one is, and some things he says are pointing into this direction, because in the paper he says, I think, I don't just want to be like destructive, I also want to do something constructive here. And then he proposes the spectrum. And that's where I think, or where one might read him like, look, the spectral argument is really like destroying the possibility of bodybuilding being a sport, but I don't want to be too mean. I give you something. And then he offers the spectrum as like a supplemental idea or something like this. That is another way. And then there would maybe be no problem combining both if we say that the spectrum argument only focuses on one sub-condition of the categorical argument, which would be the skill component. But I guess that is something we we get into when we talk about the details of the argument.
Yep. Adrian, I was going to say just very quickly, and Eric prefaced this before we went on air, that I would assume like in these philosophical arguments or exchanges, let's say of ideas, because we're all trying to get to a deeper understanding, that it's perfectly natural to try and dissect one's argument. The question in and of itself is super interesting. We'll talk about kind of the meta commentary outside of this in the fitness industry and the weight behind that value people associate with something being considered a sport or not a sport. But the nature of participating in these discussions, would you not say, is that you take a look at the strength of the argument, you look at aspects that you may disagree on, build a case for said argument, and then go forth. So there's no personal attack on anything that this individual did. My question related to that to both of you, however, was that did you decide to go over the categorical argument and then the spectrum argument because you thought there are things in there to unpack? And let's say if maybe both of you thought to yourself, from Eric, you participating, Adrian, you knowing about bodybuilding and so on and so forth, that within the constraints of the argument, there was some validity, that you would go outside of that. Like, how would you approach it if basically from the two positions that he had, if you thought they were valid? Like, is this always the standard procedure, I'm saying, in response, like let's say a philosophical paper in response, that you would follow his operative definitions, which you did for this paper?
Mm-hmm. So it's not a standard procedure. The strategy that we took on the paper is to say we try to agree with as much as possible that Aranyosi says.
Yep.
And we only disagree at some points. We want to make like real good arguments why we disagree at this few points, and then show that if we accept all the stuff Aranyosi is saying and just disagree on the little parts, we nonetheless get the outcome that actually his claims are not valid.
Yeah.
You can do philosophy totally different. You can say like, I reject all the premises of all your arguments because, and then you give reasons. But the way we did it is more like, from a strategic point, more economical, because if you can agree with a lot the other person is saying, you don't have to invest the argumentative effort to refute his points, or you might even disagree with him. And I, for example, disagree with some ideas about what are necessary conditions for something being a sport. But the funny thing is, I can like, for the sake of the argument, I can agree with them all and nonetheless show that Aranyosi is not right, which is even cooler, I think, as an argument, actually.
Yeah, it's essentially the opposite of how this argument goes on Reddit. You know, we're trying to steel man, if you will, the argument rather than straw man it. And for those who aren't familiar with those terms, a straw man is a logical fallacy where you create a similar but subtly different, or sometimes blatantly different argument than what the person is saying. Either you know, depending on intent, you may purposely or accidentally misrepresent the other person and then argue against that straw man, the actual, not actual person. And then this gives you basically an advantage because you don't have to address what they said. So I think from a charitability perspective, and we've talked about the principle of charity on this podcast before and how it's a really good way to address, discussions and arguments, because ultimately you do get to a better understanding, and it basically takes the time to make sure that you have them right. Because in my experience, the basis of most conflicts are misunderstandings rather than people with completely opposed, philosophies of whatever. Anyway, I think to give a more practical example, like I'm not super familiar with this academic background. That would be Adrian, but the categorical argument that Aranyosi made is based upon philosophers of sport that go all the way back to the 70s, like McBride and Morgan. He cites in 1975 and 1977. So if we had decided to reject the premise that the four necessary conditions for something to be a sport were invalid, we would be arguing against 50 years of academic research piled on top of that. And for those who are going like, what are you talking about? Basically, Aranyosi sets out, based upon prior research, 4 conditions for something to be a physical sport, like Adrian mentioned. So something has to be a physical skill. Mm-hmm. It has to be active, so it has to be an active skill. The skill has to be judged, and then the outcome of the competition needs to be ranked. So to give a little more detail on each one, the physical skill, it means that it has to actually be something that you can get better at or worse at, and it is a non-trivial task, and it's physical in nature. 2, the skill has to be active rather than passive. So this one lacks a little bit of clarity to me, at least in how it's presented in this argument, but it can't be some type of passive physical skill, like it's putting away books or something like that, for example, something that wouldn't have any element of athleticism or being dynamic. Then there's judgment by skill, so that people can be seen to be better at it or poorer at it, and that you're overcoming something challenging. And that means that you can get better at it, and that you getting better at it impacts your performance in the sport. And Aranyosi basically claims that those 3 that bodybuilding does not meet them, and it only meets the ranking criteria. So yes, bodybuilders are placed and judged and can win a competition, but what they're doing on stage, at least, not necessarily in training, is not a physical skill. It's not active, and you can't get better at it, what you're doing on stage. You might get your physique better, but what you do on stage is just displaying that. So, Adrian, do you think that's an accurate representation of kind of the background here?
That's perfect regarding the categorical argument, yes.
Yep.
So that's kind of what Aranyosi lays down, and he makes a case that those 3 categories bodybuilding fails. And that is really, I think, the crux of our disagreement. When Adrian shared this paper with me, I read that, and I was like, man, I just don't agree. And here's the interesting point. Eric Helms is not necessarily convinced that bodybuilding is a sport, but I am convinced that those 3 criteria and the way they're presented, especially against posing, which is essentially the way it was leveraged. Because Aranyosi, when you read the paper, and I'm trying my best to accurately represent it, I know he's not here. And again, this is not about piling on. This is about, a deeper understanding. Unlike Reddit, the goal is not to win. The goal is to learn more. So it's not just, taking whatever line of evidence supports your argument, ignoring the rest. But Aranyosi basically, in my view, and let me know if you view this differently, Adrian, he sees the potential counter-argument to what he's saying as someone might go, oh, but posing is a physical skill. And he therefore tries to dissect posing. And I think his dissection shows a level of, I don't think it was accurate, just to be blunt. I don't think it accurately represented the physical task, the actual physiology of what's going on when it happens, nor the subtle details, which I do admit takes a skilled eye to tell the difference in what is going on with less and more skilled posers.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that the way you discuss posing, it's just like getting in a position and presenting your vascularity and your muscles is maybe what it must seem to someone who, I don't know, watches like a 10-second clip of pumping iron or something. That's all that's going on. But I would say if you take a little bit more time, even if you're not a bodybuilder looking at it, or if you ever tried to do a lat spread without somebody explaining you how to do it, and you think, I don't have lats. Where are they? Why is nothing happening here? You really quickly get a taste of, okay, there's something to learn actually here, right? And that is, even though I've never been on stage and I never posed, just from the little things I know, I felt like that cannot be right.
Yep. So let me ask you this, Adrian, to give a little bit of credit to Aranyosi as a philosopher. If his claims about posing were true, let's just say that what he said is actually true. They're not, and we'll explain why in a moment. Would you think that the argument, his categorical argument, was solid?
So we have I would say we wouldn't be able to get him on this argument if he would be right. So I really think, because he claims that it's not a skill, and then he also claims that it's not judged as a skill, right? And if he would have shown that it is not a skill, then the game would be over. We would have lost, because even if it's judged, if it's not a skill, it's not judgment by skill. So this argument would go through. So it's actually, he had a weak point at the posing thing, and we tried to get advantage here. And otherwise, I would say this part of the paper would have been like tightly and well argued.
Yeah. So, and to his credit, I can understand, and again, I'm assuming here that someone who is not as heavily involved in the sport of bodybuilding would make these errors, because the entire purpose of good posing is to make something look fluid and easy and to make your physique look better, but for the person not to think that the reason your physique looks better is because you're posing it well, but because you just have a better physique. And so the outcome of the skill is what his argument is. That's the appearance of what's going on. But I think much like other very impressive athletes can make something incredibly challenging look easy, that is also what's going on in bodybuilding. So I really like that you mentioned like clips of bodybuilding. The experience of being at a live show, I think is really valuable. And I'm going to give just a personal story. In 2009, that was the first time I got into the overall of an open division bodybuilding competition. This was, at the time, what was called the INBF Capital City. That's now known as the Muscle Mayhem. That's the largest natural bodybuilding show. That was an amateur-only show at the time. It's now a pro-am in California that Bob Bell, who we've had on the podcast, who now actually is one of the owners of the WNBF, or the president of the WNBF, I should say, at the time was a promoter along with his wife, Tina. And I had won the heavyweight division, which means I wasn't lean enough. And now you know that because I'm typically light heavy, this is why I did not win the overall. And also just because it was Moji Alou and Jeff Alberts, so I wouldn't have won it even if I was leaner. But nonetheless, I got into the overall with some of these very impressive gentlemen. The overall lasted 35 minutes. So that is mandatory comparisons, rotating, being moved around. And it was not that, oh man, it was so close because of Eric Helms. It was because there was a 1 point difference in the final judges' score between Moji Alou and Jeff Alberts. And Moji ended up edging Jeff Alberts out. Next show he did the next month, Jeff won his pro card in Washington. So interesting backstory there. And that was actually when 3DMJ formed our discussions backstage. But anyway, so the four of us, the lightweight, the middleweight, light heavy, and myself, the heavyweight, were being compared for 35 minutes. Notably, this occurred after very, very similar mandatory comparisons in the prejudging that typically lasted, they weren't as tight, they weren't as competitive in the individual classes, but because there was more competitors. So, you've got 4 people in the overall, then each one of those classes typically has, 3 to 8 people. So those are larger classes or similar in size and the kind of the two ends of the weight classes, lightweight and heavyweight. And so they went through between 10 to 20, maybe 25 minutes of posing there as well. Active, moving around. Now, the interesting thing that happened to me is about 20 minutes into this, I was sweating and I sweated off my tan and it looked like melted chocolate was running down. And it was to the point where people were laughing in the audience. And I did this on stage. I just went like, hey, here it is, And it's not that sweat. I'm not going to pretend as a sports scientist to be like, hey, want to know how exerted you are? How much are you sweating? Like, absolutely not the case. But it does co-vary with exertion many times. And it was incredibly challenging. And I was doing my best to maintain the positions that I needed to. And having seen the footage, I didn't do a great job. And another interesting thing that people are probably aware of is, by the time you get on stage, you've dieted for months. And some competitors, unfortunately, are cutting water or manipulating electrolytes. And a very common thing you will not see in the clips, like Adrian is pointing out, but that you will see if you go to a live show when it's close, is people sometimes fainting or visibly, putting their hands on their knees, catching their breath. And you will hear judges say something like, once you're on stage, you're being judged. So you'll see competitors, even when there's even a larger class, and they're not in the first call out, and they're along the two sides or the back, waiting to be called out, holding a front relaxed and smiling, because they look great. This is easy, right? I always look this muscular and shredded. And what's actually happening is they are suffering and trying not to shake. So if you were to ask any competitor who has been in a close competition, they would tell you that at the very least, and we can go through our rebuttals to his argument, bodybuilding is hard. And I thought immediately the easiest one of these things to refute was the passive, that is not active. Because just because posing looks like you're holding poses does not mean that it's a static, passive activity. It is an isometric contraction of most of the muscles in your body. You are actively contracting your biceps against your triceps so they look, big and full in certain poses. You're actively doing a small amount of vacuum on the lat spread and sometimes the side chest, as well as the front double bicep, depending on how you pose it, which is hard. If you're trying to practice the vacuum pose, you're contracting not only your quads, but you're also popping your butt out a little bit to get the sartorius to pop. When you go into your rear shots, like you said, a lat spread is a very skilled movement. Every single one of the positions is requiring at least more than half of the muscles in your body to be not fully contracted, but contracted relatively hard. Typically about 80 to 90% of how hard you feel like you can contract them, because more than that, little posing tip, it doesn't look any different, but it does tire you out faster and you shake. So that's an easy one. And, it was easy for me just to cite papers on the nature of isometric contractions, the use of isometric training in sport. And I think even if Aranyosi was to write a rebuttal to a rebuttal, that one would probably stay, unticked. And that's just, I think it's very easily refutable. I don't know if you agree, Adrian, if you thought that was the easiest one to refute.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely made it look easy, I would say. As easy as Aranyosi thinks posing might be on stage, so to say. And I think here, I have the intuition that this cannot be wrong, but you made here, thanks to your knowledge about the literature and the physiology, you made this point way stronger than I would have even thought one could make it.
Good. Eric, real quick, the part I found interesting, and I said this off air, that reading his abstract, it was compelling, right? And then when you get actually into the categorical argument, as someone who's only done some posing under the guidance of Eric, but I've heard Eric talk about, I've seen the athletes that kind of as the linchpin, the posing component, and that weird, I do think that differentiation between passive and active, and then calling it static, and that kind of almost like binary distinction, in order to really make it seem more compelling than nothing's going on. Not in his case, but just overall the concept of what goes into posing betrays a fundamental understanding of what posing is. And like you could almost break down, I was thinking about this while I was reading that, almost any movement or any sport, like I was thinking about weightlifting, Eric, as an example, that when one does posing, you're getting into this, you're using all these muscles, all these contractions and so on to get to finished position. And that finished position is presenting something to the judges, like most muscular, doesn't matter, lat spread. But like in weightlifting, there's the active component that you're doing, and the doing is like the clean and the jerk, and then you have to hold it up overhead. Now you have to hold it under control until the judges to say down. And you're actually in now what can be described, it's not quite a passive position, but you're not supposed to be moving. You're supposed to be showing control. Well, when you're posing, something kind of similar is going on. Yeah, they might have intra-abdominal pressure when they have like the 200 kilo jerk over there. They're controlling it, but there's that there's a contraction going on. They're controlling it. When you're posing, it's something similar. If you're to extend out for a weightlifter from like 2 seconds of control at the top to 10 seconds, if you keep expanding that by that same kind of operative definition, then the movement of weightlifting that they're doing, there's a passive component at the end, and then there's an active component. And I think that the distinction between the two to try and differentiate what someone is doing and the strength of the argument was it was just interesting to me that what, when you went down the list, so the first thing that he said, and then he went into like active passive, was like, oh, and then posing, I read posing. I thought of all the time that I did with Eric for like an hour posing practice. It just made me think, as a side note before you guys go on, that sometimes the strength of one's argument, it's like, have you tried this at all? Like just posing in general. Because simply if one was to try it, and as you said, Eric, you want to like the isometric contractions, the agonists, and like into the actual science behind it. But if you were to try, you'd be like, oh, this isn't just, because passive to me is a term used to almost diminish what is being done, right, at that end position of what someone's doing, or static. The idea like you're holding it, and holding it has the connotation that it's easy, right? Kind of what we're saying, as opposed to, oh, when you're lifting or when you're exerting yourself, to your point. So I do think you bringing up the fact that you were sweating for 20 minutes in, and it wasn't just the lights. It's the act of posing itself that did that was very curious for me. So yeah.
And there's numerous examples of this in sport too. The Hercules hold in strongman, scrum in rugby. Your example was great. One that I was just thinking of, because gymnastics is on my mind, which you'll realize why it is in a bit. The balance beam. If you were just to shift the camera up to the point where the bottom of the camera was in line with the balance beam, and you watched all of the movements that were not jumps or flips, and even actually some of the jumps, it would not look that impressive. It is because you have the reference point of knowing that they're on a thin beam while they're doing this that it is impressive. And I think that's almost a good analogy to posing, in that, oh, you looked ripped, you look shredded, I can see all the separation, your muscles look big. If I was to completely relax and just stand there, that's what it would require. That's the equivalent of moving the camera up to the bottom of the balance beam.
Yep.
If instead of front relaxed, I really just stood there facing you relaxed. Like, an in-contest bodybuilder who is really muscular would still look awesome. You see a muscular guy walking down the street or chilling there against the wall, or gal, it looks pretty impressive. But the amount that you can improve the way you look by doing that, I think that's something anyone on Instagram knows, where it's like, oh, abs flexed, sucked in, good lighting versus not. Like, oh shit, it makes you look like you just lost 5% body fat. So that is, like, I understand his argument, because if you are only seeing the result of a skilled posing session or clips of people when they're not lapsing in their posing ability, that's what it can appear to be. But I think that is a relatively common occurrence when we're talking about skilled movement by, sport practitioners. So yeah, that one relatively easy. And just to kind of, we're jumping around a little bit. We're not going in order. So physical skill, activity, and then judgment by skill. We just kind of showed how we refuted the activity component, which was claimed, hey, this is not actually challenging. You're just standing there. You certainly can't say, according to Aranyosi, that just standing there and displaying your muscles is an active skill, but it is. So I think, Adrian, do you want to go through the physical skill component?
Yeah, we can. Maybe we can do this next. So the physical skill component was, So the basic idea that Aranyosi articulates here, that is that what we necessarily need for a sport is that what we do there and what basically makes up the sport is a physical skill. One kind of thing most people might think of in like classical example of sport is, for example, I don't know, shooting an arrow, right, or jumping very high, or whatever you do in whatever kind of sport. And what he says is that if we look at bodybuilding, what seemed to be judged there are the components of muscularity, appearance because of like low body fat and stuff like this, and muscularity. And actually there is the way we present it qua the posing component, but actually there is no real skill involved, because he seems to think that the act of posing, which might the only thing akin to a skill that could be judged there, is actually not a skill. So there's no judgment of skill, just the judgment of physical appearance, that, as he admits, is very hard to achieve. There is a lot of activity going in there, dieting, training, eating regimes, and so on and so on. But in the end, what we see on stage is not a skill. I think that, is this characterization fair? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's difficult if you don't have the paper in front of you to understand the distinction between some of these arguments. So, for example, let's say that we admit posing is a hard isometric contraction, but pretty much anybody can do it the first time they try. Now, all of a sudden, we have something that is an active thing, but it's not a physical skill, right? And the interesting thing is, if Aranyosi was able to rebut us and maintain just this one, all of a sudden, would bodybuilding become like a mental sport like chess? It's an interesting, what happens here, So I think it's important to note that I don't think there's any consensus in the philosophy of sport that you actually can have an ironclad definition of sport. Is that an accurate statement, Adrian?
I wouldn't say, the job of philosophers is to disagree with each other so you can write papers.
Sure.
So you will, I don't know any question in philosophy where I would there is a general consensus on anything, but it seems there is like a significant portion of philosophers who have given up on the idea of giving a classical definition with necessary sufficient conditions for sport.
Right. And I think that's an important point. This discussion around bodybuilding has to operate under some operational definitions and constraints, and we're staying in there. But it is very like a point you wrote in the introduction is like, this can't be solved on empirical grounds. There's no testable hypothesis of something as a sport or not. We can test it and then we can decide. So within the constraints of this model, where we have these four conditions that one must feel to be a physical sport. So this isn't about sport in general, but just is something a physical sport. I think it's an interesting one that if he's able to come back and get back one of these 3 points, that all of a sudden we could find ourselves in a situation where maybe bodybuilding is a sport, but just not a physical sport, which I find hilarious. Like, okay, when you're not competing, you're doing a physical sport or you're doing physical training, but on stage, it's a mental sport, I don't think that's the case, but there are some interesting places this could go as a consequence of what is argued, refuted, and maintained.
Yeah, I mean, if he would go down this way, he could, for example, if he read into this, pull up this idea of like mind-muscle connection, and he seems to be into the debates of the embodied mind, how like physical appearance in the world contributes what our mind actually is. It's not only about the brain; it's about the whole body, and maybe he could level an argument and say, well, it's a mental skill in the end, because actually what's going on there is what most bodybuilders would maybe call the full use of the mind-muscle connection in a very purposeful way.
Yep. I think it would be hard because there's a muscle connection, right? But I do, muscle has to be involved to some degree, Maybe if they were all sitting in chairs and we used like electrodes to show what you feel like you're what you're envisioning, who can visualize their physique the best, but in some kind of future competition. But anyway, yeah. Omar?
Well, Eric, real quick too, just because it's interesting participating in something and having some background knowledge therein. When you brought up the example of a physical skill in posing, and anyone could basically pose, thus it could be potentially an easy skill where like you teach someone how to do a bicep contraction. To me, that's like saying like in soccer, like if you have an open net and you teach someone how to kick, it's like, oh, just shoot it in the net. There's no goalie. It's like theoretically anyone could score, but now let's start putting some constraints. Now you're on stage. You talked about one contraction. I don't like Eric would be able to tell me more, but when you're on stage doing a most muscular, I'm just bringing that one up because it's one of my favorite poses. It's not just one muscle. It's pretty much everything in the house besides the muscles. Then it's like the core contraction, your face as well, because correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, even minor things like if you're straining, it depends, right? And you're making it seem difficult, then that would influence the judge. So there's so many components. And now you're in a competitive, immersive environment where you're posing next to each other. And that's now soccer played against other people as opposed to just having a net on its own. So it's like depending upon your operational constraints can really change the ease or difficulty of any of these physical skills. And I say that as also, Eric, this is me coping as someone that finds posing difficult. So I'm just like, whoa.
No, posing is difficult. And I don't know many people who, maybe some people who were dancers and then came to bodybuilding, it would feel like it's very easy to learn this skill, but it is still something they have to learn. And I think I'm trying to really steelman it. Like, maybe it's something that people think is a skill, but it's not really. But I just don't see how that could be the case. And the reason I say that is like there are posing coaches, there are posing courses. Like the organizations in bodybuilding will actually have posing workshops and seminars. There are posing awards in bodybuilding competitions. I've won some, So clearly it's something that they are ranking uniquely. That's actually something we could have brought up in the paper, although it doesn't affect your overall placing, so maybe not. But yeah, the fact that there's a posing award in competitions tells you specifically that people are looking at that, right? So that I think it's very challenging to say that there isn't a skill involved in posing and that it can't improved and that performers aren't judged and awarded based upon that. And that's something that isn't actually in the judgment by skill category, which we're going to talk about. But there is some blending here. Like, so the physical skill aspect, it's basically, is it a skillful activity? Is it a non-trivial task? Is it something you can get better at, right? And I think posing probably meets those criteria, although it may be dependent upon how close a couple people are to where it matters enough. But I think that's actually more in the judgment by skill category. When we first wrote this paper, I was actually struggling a little bit not to blend those two aspects because they're separated from an argumentation standpoint, but I do think, like you said, it's impacted by the fact that it is a competitive environment, Omar.
Oh, I didn't want to suck all the air out of the room. I want the next one. Adrian, you guys have been on fire. I've been thoroughly enjoying it. Yeah, go on.
I don't think I have anything to add to this. And yeah, I think it was really important for our paper to really disentangle these different aspects that when we see them happen, they're all happening at once. And they're like, as a natural phenomenon, they're all into one situation at the same time, and really to abstract different parts, disentangle them, and to say, okay, a physical activity can be active or passive. Is bodybuilding active, passive? We say it's active, check. Is this activity a skill that we're talking about, namely posing? Yes, no, yes, it is, check. Next point, is this active skill that posing is the one thing that is judged in bodybuilding? Yes or no? So that is basically what we have to check off part by part, and also in writing this paper to do the reader the favor to not always bring up examples that muddle things together and always directly talk about posing routine, which would involve all three aspects at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the physical skill component is an interesting one. I think the strongest evidence we presented was that, hey, if you go all the way back to the historical elements of bodybuilding, it's always been viewed as a skilled activity. There's actually a guy named, he had like a moniker like most strongmen did in this era, and the early 1900s. His name was Montesaldo. And he specifically wrote a book, How to Pose. He was commissioned to write this book because he was known to be a strongman performer who also could display his physique in a very impressive artistic way. And I am saying artistic, and I'm acknowledging that bodybuilding has always been art and sport. And I do think one can have elements of both and still be sufficiently enough of one to be one or the other. And in our case, I think the argument appears to be, although again, I'm not necessarily sold on it, but within the constraints of this argument, bodybuilding is a very art-like sport. So Montesaldo, he has this book, How to Pose. And in it, he talks about all of the elements, like there's chapters written on how to pose for photographs, as well as some of the proto bodybuilding competitions that were going on, and how to display your physique in a way for at the time, which met kind of like the aesthetic ideals, which was a little more based upon the Grecian mold and the actual artistic pose itself. Ironically, it was probably more artistic then than it is now, versus a little more physical and competitive now. And he also talks about muscle control, which is something that you could be a muscle control practitioner, and that was a thing and kind of still is a thing, where isolating certain muscles, contracting them. Like you guys have probably seen maybe cool pictures or videos of people contracting like one side of their abdominals, or doing like a vacuum on one side, contracting their transverse abdominis, and the other, or seeing this rolling pattern in their abs. Or just the most prominent and well-known one is just the vacuum pose. So classically, one of the best vacuum posers was Frank Zane, and he could just suck in his abdominal wall, and you could see the serratus. You could see, just all of the musculature, which was not normally on display, that weren't just the blocky abs coming out. And then now in modern times, Chris Bumstead does a great job of doing that, and you will see some of these more muscle control elements shown by some of the classic physique competitors. And essentially the idea is that you have such fine control over different muscle groups that you can highlight different specific things. You can not contract some things and contract others. And there's an art to that. And it's obviously a very skilled movement. So that's been there historically. Being able to incorporate even slight vacuums can make your taper appear better. It makes the waist look even smaller, makes the lats and shoulders appear like they're coming out even more. And again, that's something you might not even pick up on if you're just looking at, oh, this guy's got a small waist. It's like, well, part of the reason is because he's using muscle control. And that has roots that are over 100 years old, right? So, and then again, this is kind of the tagline which we started with. Adrian said, hey, we got to point out that Franco and Arnold took ballet classes during pumping iron, and that's we have video evidence of that from the 70s. And that is true. And that wasn't just some performative thing for the the documentary that Desmond Butler, that's his father, put on. And so, yeah, choreography and the posing elements are something that have been shown to be a skill forever. There's even that scene where Arnold is helping that amateur bodybuilder adjust his pose from being a little more like that to a little more like that, and saying, hey, the little guys, you always try to clamp down to be big, but you got to open it, show them, like that part of Pumping Iron is a more experienced poser instructing a less experienced poser. And when you see Ed Corney, arguably the greatest poser of the 70s, doing his thing, and ironically being asked to pose as part of an art exhibition, you can see that this is a skilled activity. Yes, very artistic, but still a physical skill. So I think the fact that there are these seminars, the fact that there's these workshops, the fact that it is something that bodybuilders teach, practice, and seem to at least believe there are levels to me, combined with the active passive kind of argument before, really means this is a physical skill. And then the question is really, well, how much does it impact your performance and your placing? And that's kind of where we get into the last thing that the Aranyosi argues against, which is the judgment by skill criteria. And I think this one is the most understandable, in my opinion, of how he could arrive at his conclusions if he's not familiar with what actually goes into placings, and if he's not familiar with all the different divisions in bodybuilding. So we're saying bodybuilding. Some listeners might be thinking of the overall umbrella of bodybuilding, so like figure competitors, bikini competitors, men's physique, classic physique, fitness, which actually has like gymnastic routines in it, which we'll talk about. But other people might be thinking bodybuilding like, okay, Ronnie Coleman versus Jay Cutler, and so and it's not clear which one Aranyosi is talking about in his paper, which I would say is somewhat of a weakness. Is he talking about the bodybuilding division, or is he talking about bodybuilding umbrella as a sport? And I think the most obvious answer, if you don't know, is to go, well, it's got to be the whole thing, because bodybuilding is just a division under the bodybuilding sport. And when you look at it from that perspective, at best, you can say that maybe some divisions have less of a judgment by skill criteria or component to their posing than others. And maybe you can make an argument that some divisions are less or more sport-like. But ultimately, there are some divisions where posing is heavily judged. So the weird thing about this, guys, is that the divisions that people typically think are probably more sport-like because they demand more muscularity, more leanness, and they're just harder, which I think is ultimately what people, not in a philosophy paper, but on like Reddit, think, okay, what makes something a sport? Was it hard? And people will balk at powerlifting being a sport because they're just lifting once, or whatever. Or they'll balk at, say, for example, race walking, right? Because like race walking definitely meets all these criteria, but it's walking. That's not a sport, or curling, and I don't mean like physically curling something, but on ice, so it's important. This is not a Reddit argument. This is not, I find it distasteful that this is considered a sport because sport is something I respect.
Yep.
It is, does it meet these criteria? And you're allowed to think bodybuilding is silly. It is. But it might be a silly sport, unfortunately. So for those people who don't like it. And I think this is interesting, right? In that bodybuilding itself, the bodybuilding division, it places much more emphasis on simply raw muscularity, leanness, and comparing proportionality between people. There is a posing round. It is judged in most federations, but not all, and not in all competitions. So, for example, if you were in an NPC show or an amateur, an NPC show, I think this is still the way that they operate. If you don't place in the top 15 in the prejudging based upon the mandatory routine alone, you don't even get to do your posing routine to music. Okay? So there are some cases where it's not the posing routine, which is the most obvious example of a skilled, independent, this is just for the posing thing. Because posing kind of takes two forms in competitive physique sport. There is the mandatory poses, where everything we've talked about up to this point is highlighting your physique and makes your physique look either better or worse than it otherwise would have, and that's compared against others. And I think that stands on its own. But if you really wanted to easily refute Aranyosi, we would just need to go back to a time where the posing routine was always the second round of judging, and had equal weight to the mandatory poses. And that's not the case in all the divisions, okay? So kind of on one end of the spectrum, on just the judgment by skill criteria, we have the bodybuilding division, where you don't necessarily always get to do the routine. It may or may not be judged depending on the level, where you place, whether there's a tie, the federation, all that stuff, which I'll get into in a moment. And then on the kind of the other end, we have the more quote-unquote subjective divisions. So for example, bikini, if you look at the actual criteria, if you look at the rules as stated by the IFBB or say the WNBF, which are the ones we use to kind of give like the most prominent enhanced and natural organization in our paper, they specifically judge things and ask the judges to grade quality of movement, grace, quote-unquote personality, and the fluidity. And, so they don't have a posing routine. They have typically like a T-walk where they walk to different positions on stage, fit a pose, and they're encouraged to have almost like pageant-like elements to the way they present themselves, right? And so those qualities, specifically of how they move, not their body, go into their placings. So there's an interesting situation where you could almost make an argument within this specific criterion that bikini is closer to sport than bodybuilding, which I think is hilarious. And it shows that we are operating within the constraints of an argument that is not arbitrary, but it is unique, I will say. So now, I think one thing that Aranyosi would grant is that if we were to talk about the fitness divisions, now these have massively waned in popularity. They hit their peak, I would say, in the 80s and 90s. Also when like step aerobics was huge as a sport and people were doing that. But these are essentially the purest blend of sport and art, in my opinion, where in bodybuilding, so they will typically have the mandatory posing rounds. And for the women, it's kind of judged similarly to figure. And for the men, it's kind of judged similarly to men's physique. So you go through the mandatory rounds, you look for symmetry, you look for muscularity, but you don't need to be nearly as lean or nearly as muscular as, say, the bodybuilding division or even the figure division or men's physique. But then they specifically have a judged routine that includes gymnastic moves, dance moves, and say like plyometric moves, like a clapping push-up or a backflip acrobatics. And that is judged independently. And specifically in the rule book, it says you are judging the routine, not the physique. And in the IFBB, they actually put "not" in all caps, just to kind of really emphasize that. So that's still under the bodybuilding umbrella, even though the popularity is low, even though it's not the main thing people think about with bodybuilding. So at the very least, if I wanted to be the most charitable to Arianosi's argument, he'd kind of have to grant that as sport, and everything else is sort of like, I guess, sport adjacent, But ultimately, when you look at the actual judging criteria, this is pretty straightforward, rebutted in one way or another to various degrees. So for example, in the WNBF, posing routines are used to break ties. So if two people, they pose very well in the mandatory round, they both have really, really good physiques, and the judges are deadlocked, what they're going to do is they're going to look at the posing routine, who did a better job, and that's going to determine whether one of these people takes first or second, or maybe third or fourth, right? And that's probably one of the lower elements of emphasis on the posing routine itself. And then in the IFBB, those are actual judged rounds, so they're given a little more weight. And that's the IFBB Amateur, kind of the bigger organization separate from the NPC and IFBB Pro League. And when you look at each single individual division, there's at least one instance in the rules, and typically more than one, where they discuss the importance of posing itself. And it is something that is to some degree independently judged, or at least has a direct and continuous impact on the physique. So it's really challenging to say that there's no judgment by skill. At the very least, I think if I wanted to, throw Aranyosi a bone, you could say that it's a more or less relevant portion of the judgment by skill within these various divisions. But if we want to talk about the umbrella sport of bodybuilding as a whole, posing is independently judged per the rules to some degree in all divisions and impacts placings, at least at higher level competitions.
Yeah, when I get a step back from the content of the argument, which you laid out perfectly well, is what I think it's interesting about this point to see is also how it works philosophically in terms of how the argument goes. Because what Aranyosi is doing here, and which is giving us the chance to argue against him, is that he is making like a very specific kind of claim that you're usually very careful about in philosophy, namely an universal claim. He basically says all bodybuilding is so and so, and to refute it this generalization, you only need like one single counterexample, and the generalization is away. I mean, if you're able to make this kind of generalizations about something and you can back them up, it's super cool because you really achieved something on a philosophical level and also on a scientific level if you find something that really generalizes very well. But on the other hand, you're open to all sorts of attacks, and it's very often it's quite possible to find at least one counterexample to something, which is what we did here, and which is like a common strategy in philosophy. You read a paper and you say like, okay, where are the most generalized claims? Do have some counterexamples coming to mind? I've got one. I can refute this argument.
Yeah. So that was how we went through the categorical argument. We pointed out the rules, which state, at least to some degree in each division, hey, there is a judgment by skill, where posing is specifically mentioned, not in just the way it impacts the presentation of the physique, which I think is a point that I think if Aranyosi really leaned into his point about the skill being used to display the body versus the skill being used to do something with the body, he might have something. But it was muddied. And we'll talk about that in a second, because he brings it up with dance, which is kind of both, and it's more about the movement or the artistic element of the movement, but it's still something not just displaying the body. But anyway, so that's how we refuted the judgment by skill. The activity criterion we were able to refute just by the fact that, isometric contractions are still, or I should say isometric muscle actions are still active, regardless of what they look like. And then the physical skill criteria we described by all the evidence and history and industry around posing, just showing that it is something that people are striving to get better at. And we also had some really great quotes from Bob Bell. There is no empirical data that is categorized like, what is your heart rate while posing? And that's what I wanted to find. Like, I looked hard. Don't get me wrong, guys. Like, I was like, I wonder if anyone has done something on a comparable isometric full body kind of contraction with no external load or not pushing against something, or if someone has done actual. I was like, has Schoenfeld done this? If anyone's done this, Schoenfeld might have did this, because I didn't do it. Like, so who is like, hooked like a mask up to someone while doing posing and like try to get their oxygen exchange or done lactate pricks while they're doing posing, but no one's done that. So instead, we had to take the kind of those other arguments that I already mentioned, and we also reached out to Bob Bell, who's the president of WNBF, as well as an experienced bodybuilding judge, and he also used to be a WNBF pro back when he was a competitor. And he gave us what you can do in some papers when there's a lack of evidence in an area. The next best thing you can do is you can get a personal communication. You can get someone who would be reasonably assumed to be an expert in the area or knowledgeable on the topic. It's not the same as an empirical study. We're not claiming it is, but you get their impression, and you can kind of introduce into the literature, hey, here's our best understanding of it before we've done, empirical work or a true, philosophical, deductive or inductive argument with something, whatever. And Bob basically said, yeah, it takes years to learn how to pose. Posing is a skillful, challenging thing. You might be in a pose down for 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And, in a close competition, it can determine your placing. And I've seen it matter, and I've also seen it not matter, where someone was just so dominant in their physique that didn't matter how good number two posed. They were just going to, get the best poser award, still play second. So, and we used that quote, and, Bob got to read the paper. He was really happy to be a part of it. And that was kind of the evidence that we used in each one of those categories. And I think it was actually I found it much more challenging to address the spectrum argument than the categorical argument. If I don't know if you would agree, Adrian.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the spectrum argument, I mean, in the categorical argument, the strategy was easy, right? We just try to head on refute the claims that these factors don't apply to bodybuilding. And for the spectrum argument, which there might also have been the intuition that something is off here, we really had to think about, okay, which way do we want to address it? Because in the drafts of the paper, we had like different versions how to go about it, right? And in the end, we made a decision for something that seems elegant, strong, and not too bulky to stay within the borders of the paper regarding how many words we are allowed to use.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the challenging thing for us is that the way the spectrum argument was presented was not clearly as a second argument. It was more of this ad hoc concession, like you said earlier. Like, hey, it doesn't meet these conditions, but, you know, activity probably falls on some spectrum of being more art-like or more sport-like. And yeah, bodybuilding has sport-like elements, but it's probably more art-like. And if we want to, like, if we wanted to really be jerks, and we were in our first draft of this, we actually pointed out that these are mutually exclusive arguments. Something can't be more art-like and sport-like and meet necessary and sufficient conditions to be or not be a sport. So you can't have it both ways. But I don't think that's how things work in the real world. And we didn't eventually keep that poke, that jab, because I didn't think it was instructive. Like, he's saying, all right, let's try to establish, being charitable to Aranyosi, some conditions for something to be a physical sport. Bodybuilding fails that. Great. And then, more generally, yeah, it's sport-like, but it's probably not sport-like enough, even if we were to kind of just look at it on this spectrum. But the challenge with the spectrum is it's not necessarily intuitive, and he didn't provide a really, really strong basis for us to be like, oh yeah, everyone agrees. So this one, we actually did take the strategy of, to some degree, we rejected the premise. We said, look, this spectrum doesn't have like a solid theoretical grounding. We can't just say that expressive skill and embodied skill are what everyone agrees is the criteria for something to be more sport-like and art-like. So, Adrian, I think it'd be really helpful to the listener if you could talk about basically how does he set up the spectrum argument, as this continuum.
Okay, so he starts off with making a distinction between two kinds of skills, or two ways a skill can be, basically, and he's taking this distinction, as we figured out by reading from the phenomenological literature in philosophy, going back to Merleau-Ponty, embodiment debates, and so on and so on. And I don't want to bother the listeners with such specific debates, but if we put aside the philosophical jargon, which we also tried to do in the paper, and I hope we did it in a way that is fair to people who work in this area, and who forgive us that we try to break things down for another readership, that skills can be either be presentational, so the physical skill you're exercising is actually not about doing a certain feat to achieve something for the purpose of executing the feat, but it's more for you're doing something for the purpose of displaying your body in the act of doing it. So that it's the presentation over what he called embodied skill. The embodied skill is the one that is execute the feat, be great in it, nice, and the other one is show us how good you can look while you do something. For example, lift your left foot behind your head while you're standing on the other foot or something. So this is the two kinds of skills, and there's a spectrum between putting your feet behind your head to music and being able to shoot an arrow to the bull's eye. And somewhere on the spectrum, he thinks we can place a lot of things, and he says to give us an intuition where to place things. He refers, for example, to dancing, right? And he says, like, look at Lindy Hop as a kind of dance, and his intuition is that Lindy Hop would be more towards the embodied skill end of the spectrum, which he associates with sports. And on the other hand, he takes ballet, who would be more on the presentational end of the spectrum, which is more art-like. He's not giving us like true intervals on the spectrum or better criteria how to measure exactly where it is. It's a very intuitive way based on his intuitions, I would say, to put forward the spectrum.
Yeah. So it's it's difficult to articulate in writing in a clear rebuttal some of the issues that I have with the spectrum argument. I think it's easier to talk about it, and these aren't in the paper, so that might be a nice companion. But a big thing I was thinking when I was reading this is a lot of this judgment of whether something is an embodied or expressive skill is going to be dependent upon the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
So think about weightlifting videos that get shared online. There are people who are just like, look at the power, the speed, and the movement quality, and the perfect placement. The verbiage they use and the things they highlight when they slow it down, they're clearly focused on the impressiveness of the movement and the precision and the beauty of a snatch, you know? And on the other hand, you can absolutely just look at the snatch from the judges table and go, all right, did he lift the most weight? You know, did he lock his elbows out at the same time, and did he hold it under control? Here's your white light. So it's the same movement. And to some degree, the beauty of a snatch is inherent, but you're going to have some people who lift more weight and have an uglier snatch and have to like, oh shit, you know, and they chase it down. They almost get to the edge and they've got this terrible look on their face, but they lock it out. And maybe they, you know, they dump it and then ungracefully walk off the platform, right? But they still win if they lifted more than the other person. So I think to some degree, it's very challenging to disentangle embodied and expressive skills. And to me, that's why I had this gut reaction to I wanted to reject the premise immediately, like, oh, that expressive skills and embodied skills are distinct enough to put on two ends of a spectrum. And I think that's the challenge. So to articulate that, our approach was to say, look, there's not actually a theoretical basis where you can cite some awesome debate. Like, yeah, you got this 1940 citation that says maybe there are expressive skills and embodied skills, but why would we just accept that we should map that onto the decision to make something a sport or something art? And truly, there is no theoretical basis for that, right? It's not something that we can just accept. So we didn't. And instead, we pointed out that this doesn't match some of our normal intuitions. You know, so we said, okay, by your intuition, Lindy Hop ballet, and then, you know, near ballet probably is bodybuilding, and neither one is sport, they're more art-like. And we brought up the example of gymnastics, Olympic gymnastics. So for those who don't know, there's two forms of Olympic gymnastics. There's the one that most people are familiar with, and that gets a little more hype on TV. That's ironically called artistic gymnastics. And that's, you know, the floor work, the beam, the pommel horse, it has more elements of embodied skill, if you will, but the way gymnastics is scored, and by the way, go all the way back to when we had Andrew Valdez on to talk about gymnastics, along with another expert in the field whose name I'm forgetting right now. I do apologize. It's a long time ago, but we had a really good episode on gymnastics if you want to learn more about it. But anyway, there's two scoring criteria. There's basically how hard is the move you're trying to do, and it meets like a baseline skill. So some moves amateur gymnasts can't even do. They're like, look, I'm not going to even try that. I physically cannot do that, right? I can't get in those body positions. I can't turn that many times in the air. I don't have the power or the coordination, whatever. And then the second one is the execution score. How well did you do that skill? Okay, you've done the skill, but how well? And so that's an interesting aspect, right? And that exists both in artistic gymnastics and also rhythmic gymnastics. Now, have you ever seen rhythmic gymnastics? They have like the hoop and the ribbon. So the ribbon is great, like, because it is a very expressive skill. Like, how are you twirling the ribbon around your body while you're doing interesting gymnastics moves? And sometimes they're not necessarily explosive. Like I would say the ribbon is a little more like ballet than it is Lindy Hop, right? Because Lindy Hop, you know, explosive, kind of like, you know, you have to be pretty athletic. So these the kind of intuitive feelings that Aranyosi has about different forms of dance can also be applied to gymnastics. In gymnastics, both of these are recognized Olympic sports, right? Yep. So rhythmic gymnastics is, since I think the 80s, has been a women's Olympic sport, artistic gymnastics even longer. And these are iconic sports of the Olympics. You know, when you see the rings of the Olympics, you'll typically see someone doing some flips or someone, you know, bending back over a balance beam. And our argument is basically saying, hey, like Lindy Hop and ballet, you can make the same thing with artistic and rhythmic gymnastics. And by the way, rhythmic gymnastics has just as many performative elements as bodybuilding, at least arguably. So if we accept the spectrum as is and your intuitions, we're now taking two identified Olympic sports that have been around for decades and saying they may not be sports. So this intuitive spectrum is perhaps not as intuitive as it's meant to be. It doesn't have a theoretical basis. And we would need to modify it in some way to really give us the ability to start categorizing things. Adrian, do you think I did a good job representing it there?
Yeah, that was a great job. That really well sped out our strategy here, just to say, hey, if we want to accept the spectrum, we have to make it plausible somehow. Either give us good reasons to accept it outside of like looking at what sport is and what not, which he didn't. So maybe there are independent reasons why to accept it, right? But he didn't put them in the paper. And if we don't have those reasons, we somehow have to do what sometimes in statistical modeling is called like a sanity test to see if a model is giving the right predictions. You test the model. If it's giving the right predictions, you can accept the model and use it. And we did the same with the spectrum. Basically, we said, okay, if the spectrum is to be accepted, it should somehow categorize iconic sports as more sport-like than art-like, and it doesn't. So something seems to be off with the spectrum, and we shouldn't use it. Yeah.
Yep. And we even propose some ways to potentially make it better. So because that's what we're trying to do. Like, you steel man the person you're working against. So we said, okay, well, what if we put a threshold somewhere on there so that we don't lose any of these iconic sports? And our proposal was, all right, well, let's put the threshold right at rhythmic gymnastics, because there may be a more artistic, well-known sport that's possible. We just couldn't think of one more than rhythmic gymnastics. Let's put it there. And ironically, now your spectrum argument is no longer a spectrum or a continuum of more sport-like or art-like. It is only sport-like or art-like in so much as it eventually categorizes it as a sport or art. So it becomes a de facto categorical argument, which is interesting. And we said, look, arguably, if we're going to chuck this line in the sand on the spectrum after rhythmic gymnastics, it's also going to be after bodybuilding. So I think they have comparable, at least arguably. You've got to give me a good reason. Maybe you can make it. Maybe the next one is, okay, I'm going to keep rhythmic gymnastics, but guess what? Bodybuilding is a millimeter to the right of that. You didn't make the cut. Sorry, buddy. Maybe next year. And that's fair. But that's one thing someone could do if we put the threshold there, is they have to refute us. But I think the most obvious refutation is to say, well, actually, rhythmic gymnastics is not a sport. And the way it works in a philosophical argument like this is that it's not like the burden is not on our shoulders to say that an established sport isn't a sport. You got to give us a reason. So look, we're taking an established sport, rhythmic gymnastics and artistic gymnastics to some degree, and saying they are sport because the spectrum itself is just this intuitive thing, and it should match what is currently considered sport. And if that therefore also encompasses bodybuilding, you got two options. You got to either go, okay, maybe bodybuilding is a sport, or you got to reject gymnastics. And if you want to do that, then you got to explain to me why gymnastics is not a sport, because for all intents and purposes, gymnastics is a sport.
I think personally, this episode is super interesting within the constraints of what was put forth. And then I think there's that conversation, as we said afterwards, about in the fitness space, the validity of bodybuilding as a sport that's separate from this argument. But even to your point, Eric, just one thing quickly. When you said about weightlifting, which I thought was an excellent point, that perspective matters, right? From Aranosi's perspective, Lindy Hop, the embodiment part, from him not being a judge, from him probably being I'm making an assumption here, a spectator, he puts it there, and then the subjective nature of who's actually evaluating and who then would be important at the end of the day. Is it the judge? Is it the viewer? Is it a composite of both? And then why is it on the spectrum that then you have to delineate at some theoretical point that one is like, this is a sport, this is indeed not a sport, which I found that part just harder overall. Like the categorical one, it's easy, as you guys said, like as soon as you take a look at posing, like what is posing, what are you actually doing here, so on and so forth. I thought it was interesting. And after you said that, Eric, about the first pass and saying how these should be separate, when I was first reading, I'm like, is this a supplemental point where it's not that it's like, okay, so if you reject the categorical part, like let's say, what if we say, I was like, what is even, like, can we agree that there's a more artistic, expressive component than the more embodied one? So in any way, it's not a sport. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, so that's kind of how I was reading it, but I find it interesting for you guys to unpack it then verbally, especially as you said, Eric, because there's some things that are harder to write down and need definitions in a paper as opposed to just talk aloud.
Mm-hmm. I really do think there may be something if Aranyosi wanted to really go down the path of addressing the nature of the skill. Because one thing I did have to concede, or we had to concede in the paper, is that the skill involved in bodybuilding, which I do think is a physical skill, is about displaying the body. And there's no two ways around it. That's really the nature of the sport. And while rhythmic gymnastics is an expressive skill, it's not necessarily intended, at least. I mean, don't get me wrong, like gymnasts sometimes have eating disorders, sometimes get pressure to look a certain way, and certainly the shape of their body probably does influence judging, but it's not codified, right? Like if you look at judging rules, it's not like, and if you don't like how big their butt is, then you give them a poorer score, but you don't say that's why, right? So if just there's been many controversies and like stunting of growth and starving of gymnasts, which is very unfortunate. But the point is that if we remove the kind of unfortunate societal impacts on gymnasts and gymnastics, the codified rules of the sport are not about the shape of your body, are not about what your body looks like. It is about what your body does, artistic or otherwise. So the expressive or embodied skill is close to this, but it's not exactly it. Because expressive skill, when you looked kind of like at the basis of the roots of the theoretical underpinnings of why Aranyosi used this and the way he described it, it was more of, okay, an expressive skill could be displaying the body kind of like a living sculpture, or it could be how it moves artistically, and they're roughly seen as the same thing. So Aranosi's distinction was not whether it's about displaying the body or, doing something with the body, but I think if you wanted to make the argument that a sport has to be about doing something with the body, now you've actually got bodybuilding on the back foot a little bit. And it's going to run into some challenges where it might meet the sufficient, things to be like a physical discipline, but it's not actually about your performance of something on game day primarily. It has elements of it, but it's actually he is right that the purpose of your posing is to display the physique in its best light. And if someone was to make that argument, the only recourse for bodybuilding is to reject the premise and say, you don't get to say that that's not a sport. But so I don't know, this may be the creation of our own downfall, Adrian. His rebuttal is going to get us now. But I think that would be something outside of the constraints of his original argument. So it wouldn't actually be a rebuttal in my opinion. He would need to write like a new paper and say, no, you're right. And actually, what we need to consider about bodybuilding is if it is actually a physical performance in so much as the purpose of it is to do something with your body. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think there are some weaknesses in the categorical argument that could have been strengthened by parts of the spectrum argument. Exactly, if he would have pulled the distinction of like embodied and presentational skill up to the skill criterion and builded it in there and used it there to intercept our argument that posing is a skill, and somehow saying, yeah, it's a skill, but it's not the right skill to really render bodybuilding a sport. That could have been a good strategy, but nothing we also addressed in the paper. We already addressed like one potential comeback he could have. But I think that's also like cool about our paper, that we didn't write anything like end of discussion. We finally showed bodybuilding a sport. There is nothing to say. This is from now the authoritative paper that everybody has to accept. But we say like, okay, but of course, if you can make a good argument why gymnastics shouldn't be considered a sport, our argument here breaks down. If you're able to somehow provide an additional argument why we should actually accept the spectrum, and that it should be used to reclassify physical activities as sports or non-sports, and it's a good argument, be our guest. Then we might be not able to push back here. And it keeps the discussion open. It invites people to cite our paper as much as possible and write as much papers as possible against us.
Well,
playing the game, baby.
I was going to say, so you guys have this refutation of his paper, but then soon to be published will be your paper together on why bodybuilding isn't a sport. And here's how you set up the argument. That'd be the ultimate reversal. I do think, real quick, before we go on though, Eric, I think something that was cool, we were discussing, if by this definition, so the definition put forth, and let's say the paper that you guys wrote, the response, as you change some of the definitions within the constraints, so on and so forth, Eric, out of curiosity, what would be some things that people wouldn't associate with being a sport that would now probably fall within the argument that is presented? Not, I don't mean, we're talking now outside of the paper, but within now your response paper, that would be considered a sport? Just out of curiosity for the viewer.
Yeah, actually, I think anytime you take any dance and make it competitive, based upon kind of like if we accept the spectrum and we accept these criteria, and if you kind of from the framing of the way we put it, I think that would be considered a sport. So you might be a breakdancer, and if you're just doing that for fun, but when you enter a breakdance battle, which is a thing, like there's huge breakdance battles and teams go against each other and there's judges who decide whether they win, that's a sport. And you know, that is actually one of like the 4 elements of hip hop. You know, there's graph writing, DJing, MCing, and breakdancing. And this is like a cultural artistic movement that came out of, you know, the late 70s, early 80s in New York. And it's always been considered art, right? Graffiti writing, rapping, that's music, you know, DJing, music, and dance. So it's interesting that by simply adding a competitive element, which has actually always been there. And here's an I think hip hop is actually really interesting. And I only say this because I used to be heavily involved in it, like MC battles. You have an audience or a judge who judges whether you won, you know. For the lay listener who has no idea what the hell I'm talking about, think 8 Mile. So and even graph writers, they will be tagging over each other's stuff and seeing who can like get the most iconic piece in the most visible place. There's a lot of interesting cultural subversive elements as well. And there's DJ battles, like who can really mix together things like. So the competitive element has been interweaved in this art. But I think people will typically view all forms of hip hop as art, even though it has a competitive element. And if you were to take breakdancing, and a breakdancing battle specifically, and you put it into the context of this paper, it's a sport. So I think it does cut both ways. I don't have any problem with breakdancing competitively as being seen as a sport, but some people might.
Adrian, I was going to say, because following from this, I think this paper is very interesting in what you guys respond to is bodybuilding a sport. It's a completely separate discussion, the one that occurs on Reddit in the fitness community when they say bodybuilding, let's say the adage people say, oh, but it's not a sport. It's like a value judgment that they're making about what people are doing. And the sport has a heavy value associated with it. There's a connotation that if you're participating in this, you know, has A, B, C, D, and that bodybuilding does not possess these qualities, therefore it is not it. But I haven't participated in like these discussions, and I haven't seen the strength of the arguments. And kind of what you said, Eric, I think you said at the beginning of this podcast, it's in other words, the argument is related to the difficulty of how hard it is, or so on and so forth, in bodybuilding or what they're doing. And usually they bring up other superfluous elements to bodybuilding. What they're in Speedos, right? They're posing, the pageantry component. So they'll try and associate it with something else, and basically not give it the respect when you talk about the posing component. I think it's interesting you said, Eric, where you yourself, like, you'd have to think about it whether or not you consider it. Before, basically, I'd say 2019 and me discussing with you just the quick from the hip reaction is a sport. I wouldn't need to think how I define a sport in the first place. But I'd say like maybe not. You know, I'd say like probably not. And now I think my perspective in ways has changed. But why is it? My question is the following: why is it that certain, let's say, activities, physical activities that humans do, are so contentious in terms of being considered a sport, where we all kind of have that knee-jerk reaction on different levels, right? And for different activities, certainly. Oh, that's not a sport. And then if you're asked to like describe what that is, if you can really frame the argument, it becomes difficult. And then they use kind of arguments that aren't associated with what they're actually saying. So they'll say the pageantry, the posing, the this and that, the music, like, you know, whatever the case might be. So what is it that makes some physical activities, in this case bodybuilding, so contentious to be considered a sport in the first place? I know that's like the $1 million question right there, but
I have some initial thoughts, but I'm absolutely going to kick this over to the philosopher. I think it comes down to, and this is something we talked a bit about off air, is what is the purpose of sport and the value of sport in society and to individuals. And even if you know, which is something that probably kind of, well, it's changed over time, but that's probably been discussed for literally thousands of years, right? I mean, you take it all the way back in some societies, and it's like a tool to assess who is going to be on the war party, you know? or hey, this is a nonviolent way of solving a conflict between two tribes, or the roots of, or this is part of education or team building, or this is supposed to have some utility. So I think we all probably individually, based upon our life experiences, have some probably not well articulated inside of us opinion of what is the value and purpose of sport. And even though we might not be able to articulate why something doesn't like meet that, we're going to have a knee-jerk reaction and be like, that's not a sport. Like, I think, for example, if you're someone who believes that sport is all about team building, cooperation, and like if you've always come from like a football family, I have seen some interesting takes from some perennial team sport athletes who like, they don't like track and field. They're like, that's not as like, you're just running faster. Like, whatever, bro, that's not a sport. But it's like, to any general person, you can't say the 100-meter sprint is not a sport, right? So it's interesting the takes I've heard. I've heard people say like it has to have a ball involved or something like that. And I think it really just shows how much it can be colored by someone's personal experience. And I've also heard people who really viscerally hate bodybuilding, right? Because they have, and sometimes for decent reasons, not just like homophobia or something like that. But like I've talked to, sports dietitians who really, really dislike that it asks people to go to a physically uncomfortable place. But my counter argument to that is you don't see neurosurgeons saying that football is not a sport anymore because they're really disgusted by the TBIs, right? You go, yeah, that's a dangerous ass sport, right? So, and I'm comfortable with someone saying bodybuilding is a dangerous ass sport because it is, but I think sometimes these are emotional or value-based reactions rather than well-thought-through arguments, and I'm not faulting people for that, but I think they are fundamentally different to what's going on in this paper, which is interesting, and it may provide people reading this paper the opportunity to reflect on some of the decisions and judgments and conflicts they've been in themselves and assess how often those are based upon rational evaluations of evidence rather than emotional connections to their values. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I think this is a bad thing in society, and saying it's still a sport. Like, it's kind of that natural fallacy we have where as soon as I think something is a negative or I devalue it, it has become all black or white, right? And I think that is something that probably is does more harm than good generally in society, is my bias. But anyway, Adrian, I would love to hear, why do you think people have such a problem with categorizing bodybuilding as a sport or not, and why people have such strong opinions most often when they haven't even competed in it?
Yeah, good question. I mean, on the one hand, it's more like a social psychology question than a philosophy question. Why? Because the question, why do people behave like they behave? Why do they have these attitudes? Might be interesting, and I think I can't really speak to that other than guessing. But what's maybe more interesting if we try to do some sort of, I mean, what we did was basically a conceptual argument, right? We can conceptualize sport differently, and then we can make the more or less easy decision to say it falls into it or it doesn't into it. Not very like value loaded what we do here, right? But there seemed to be a way of thinking about sports which is as Omar said, more value loaded, which seemed to assume, and maybe we can do something like a rational reconstruction, how people could arrive at thinking this, not only as a gut reaction, but what rational could be behind this way of thinking, right? That we say, well, they seem to assume that there's some kind of moral virtue or character development aspect, as you said. I'm just thinking of all the sport movies I loved as a teenager, like Rocky, or I don't know, and it's always sport movies where often guys, but more and more movies also with women overcoming challenges, developing their character, growing in the team. And I think that is what a lot of people associate with sport. And I think that's not irrational. That is actually closer to another tradition about thinking about sport. Because when we look back at early contributions, or the earliest contributions to philosophy of sports, so to say, if we look at texts from Aristotle or Plato, or even in the Middle Ages, if we look at Augustine's writings about the Republic of God, how the ideal society should be structured and stuff like this, sport always plays a role. It always plays a role as a means of achievement of character development, showing one's excellence in character and body, and also educating yourself and maybe preparing yourself for tasks that might come up in life. And I think there's something to this even in bodybuilding that people then might accept. I will never forget this great video of Tom Platz when he's talking about the squat rack and where he's like saying, the squat rack is my altar. I learned how to overcome struggles by bending really heavy and stuff like this. And though I'm far away from being a seasoned lifter or anything, from the little lifting I do, I get the idea that, okay, there's something very meditative and focused also in the pursuit of bodybuilding, which might also be related to this, that people might overlook if they only see the bodies and see all the commercial stuff around it. But I don't know, guys going to the gym 6 times a week, 2 times a day, structuring the life around this and really being very dedicated about something and practicing dedication might contribute to this in a similar way than going to the boxing gym. Don't so often does. Yeah.
Eric, I'm loving this. I was going to say quick, we're about to construct the argument against bodybuilding, but when Adrian just said about overcoming and adversity, character development, so on and so forth, and people bring up films such as Rocky, it's like, I'm thinking, bro, like your 2011 bodybuilding season, there's so many, that to me, some of what you just said, like strengthens the argument of, say, bodybuilding within this context. The other one, real quick, I was going to say, Eric, is people would say they make the appeal to either nature or our biology, evolution, and so on and so forth. That they could say, sport in general, there's competition. There's sometimes there's an element, the physical prowess, where the end outcome is related to something that has an evolutionary basis. So we'd have to fight one another, whatever, or like in the environment. But like at the same time too, and so they say like bodybuilding because it's merely about like posing and displays. But then, Eric, you think about actually in, biology within a natural state, all the different like males and so forth, like the posing to this, how they look and whatnot, that there is almost an evolutionary basis, at least if we go all the way back to nature amongst other animals, for doing that, for putting on display to one another. And that is actually a proxy. Instead of fighting one another, it's like basically who looks the most in their spectrum good, like the peacock, like the male peacock's the one that shows up to try and attract the other mates, so on and so forth. So it's like, man, I don't know, with some of these arguments, as soon as you start going down the line and you start thinking about it, you can make strong arguments both ways. Eric, go on.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think that I think the same activity done for different reasons could be viewed very differently as it's whether you like it or not. And this is actually something that's heavily embedded into the overall bodybuilding community. Like everyone who loves old school bodybuilding, sometimes it might just be the surface level. I like the more natural looking physiques of, well, the natural era where they weren't performance enhancing drugs, like, Steve Reeves and earlier kind of thing, because it's something that appeals to me more. And they maybe go another step deeper and they go, oh, that's actually what the original intent of bodybuilding was, to be like the Grecian ideal.
Yeah.
And they like the artistic aspect of it, right? But like you can take it even more steps and go, okay, well, what was going on and what was actually embodied? What was judged? What was the competitive discipline of bodybuilding in the 40s and 30s and earlier? Well, actually, they had a athletic score, right? It was done, the Mr. America was done the day after weightlifting senior nationals. So you had to compete in both. So it was an adjunct to a sport. And weightlifting and bodybuilding for the first 50 years of it as a legitimate competitive sport, the first bodybuilding competition I'm aware of was in 1898, and it was after a weightlifting meet in Europe. And that format continued into the middle of the 1900s. And then it started to get divvied up because you had different people who wanted bodybuilding to be different things. You had the Weider camp who was like, listen, I don't like that you are like asking me about my moral character as a judging criteria and that I have to do a snatch and a clean and jerk the day prior. What if I just want to excel at the skill of bodybuilding, right? And whichever side you fall on, there's casualties on both sides. Like if you're like the purist who wanted to maintain the physical culture element of bodybuilding and go, no, moral character is important. That's this key element, the hero's journey that Adrian was talking about, basically, for what makes something feel like sport. I want to be Rocky. Like I want you to know that I'm a small town farm boy from Wisconsin who moved to LA, and I slept in my car so I could train. Like, you need to know the hardships I've overcome, right? So that is important. And then my understanding of the artistry of the human form, like that's important. Like that's got to be part of bodybuilding. We can't divorce it of that. Well, that wasn't always great. Like there were a number of African Americans who probably should have won the Mr. America because the ideal of moral character was a little bit racist, in this time period. So like there are, like it's tough to like you can see the push and pull of the influence of society on bodybuilding, and like why would you want to do bodybuilding, and what you see as the value in bodybuilding, and whether you see that being subverted by changes in bodybuilding is going to influence whether you like it or not. And that's going to influence whether you decide to grant it being a sport, if you hold sport on a pedestal.
Yeah.
So I think that is actually an independent discussion to our papers, but it is a very interesting one. And I think it does explain exactly what you're talking about, Omar, as to why you see these vitriolic debates as to why bodybuilding is a sport. So my personal position is I'm actually, despite the fact that I just wrote this paper, really importantly, this paper does not conclude bodybuilding is a sport. It can't. It concludes that by the criteria set out by Aranyosi, you have two options based upon our best argument. You have to accept bodybuilding as a sport, or you have to say it's not clear. I can't make a decision on that based upon what we have. I can't make an argument that bodybuilding is not a sport anymore. We're not saying that this is rebuttal to another argument, because we didn't actually set up an argument for why bodybuilding is a sport. We refuted the only known serious academic claim that bodybuilding is not a sport, which is different. It's a substantially different thing. So I don't sit here as Eric Helms going, yeah, bodybuilding is a sport. I'm saying, I'll be honest, I'm not necessarily sure whether bodybuilding is a sport. And I have actually always thought about it in terms of doing something with your body or displaying it. That is actually where I get a little wish-washy, but I also understand that's relatively subjective. I've had other athletes actually claim that powerlifting and weightlifting isn't a sport, that it's exercise. CrossFit is not a sport,
right? It's exercise.
And that it, like, why are we taking what used to be training for a sport and making that a sport? Yeah. And I think that's also that's even a harder argument to make. I think that falls apart real quick, because is playing soccer not exercise? Like it's weird, right? So, but I think these lines in the sand really come down to people's personal and cultural views of what sport is for and what the value in sport is, and the current state of a sport and whether they feel they embody it. Like I've talked to people who hate enhanced bodybuilding and hate the commercialized, like sports supplement fueled perspective, or the reasons why young men and women are getting into bodybuilding these days, what they view as superficial, but they love pumping iron. They love Steve Reeves. They love natural bodybuilding. They love when, training for not just looks, but strength. Like, hey, you get strong, and then that'll result in a body that is appreciated. And those people exist, and they butt heads. And if you kind of highlight certain aspects of the sport, you can get them on your side. I've done it many times. The people who are hypercritical of bodybuilding, they find out I'm a natural bodybuilder. They find out I'm also a powerlifter, and now I'm okay in their book. I'm not just that, that superficial Instagram influencer who, gets in a Speedo just to soothe his ego kind of thing. So it is, it's interesting to me that by highlighting different aspects of something, you can shift someone's position on something, which kind of indicates the shaky grounds that maybe their position is rested on.
Adrian.
Yeah, maybe that's the secret title of the paper. We don't know what it is, but we love it.
Hey. Adrian, I was going to say, man, this paper, so on a personal note, I feel, Eric, like we're on our greatest hits tour now with Iron Culture, except we're not playing our greatest hits. We're playing the niche hidden gems that we love. We're not playing. So, it's like Spinal Tap. They used to do the arena tour, then they started doing the club tour. And now they're just playing it intimate and interactive, like the one that we did recently with Desmond Butler about the Washington Post and IFBB Pro. This one, this episode I loved. Adrian, I'm sure you know this from listening to Iron Culture, but Eric has joked, finding the meaning of lift is kind of one of the taglines for this podcast.
Which Omar hates, by the way.
Hey, Eric's like, for the record, because it's like a dad joke, but I accept it. Like, I like it,
yeah,
and it's
great.
But the next philosophical paper I want to see, Adrian, we want to have you back on, is do you even lift? An exploration in terms of what does that even mean, right? That's the other question. We're taking all the big ones, like, is bodybuilding a sport? Do you even lift? Like, what is that about?
Yeah, I
kind of see. Go ahead, please.
Sorry, I actually think there are like a lot of, at least if you're a philosopher of science, but also if you're more from the ethics side, there are a lot of interesting things to discuss about bodybuilding. Actually, I'm not a philosopher of sport, but I know, for example, that there are philosophers of sports arguing for enhancements in sport in general, that it's actually in the spirit of sport to enhance athletes and stuff like this. And I'm pretty sure there are very specific points you could make about different kinds of sports regarding this question. And bodybuilding could be an example, or if you're more on the philosophy of science side, actually really conceptually dig into the question, what the hell is hypertrophy? So what does the concept really entail? What is not entailed, and stuff like this. So there's much gold to find in the end, I think. Yeah.
Come on, Eric.
I dig it. Yeah, I was just thinking, at this stage of Iron Culture, we're 5 years in.
Yep.
We're basically Andre 3000 after the year 2000. Like, it's not ATLians, it's not Southern Playlistic Cadillac music, it's not even Stankonia.
Yep.
We're doing whatever the hell we want.
Yep.
And the people who get it, get it. People who don't, that's why you listen to Big Boy, and that's okay, right?
Yeah.
If you want the hypertrophy roundtable with Brad Schoenfeld, we did that. But now we're talking deep philosophical points on things that are not deeply philosophical, like bodybuilding, and you just got to accept it, So there it is.
But let's open the floor then, Eric, because I took a look at the time limit. We hit the 2 hours. We're hitting the 2 hour mark here, and I think there is still more to discuss. And I was like half joking to your point, Adrian, that there's a lot. When you said you're looking up at like bodybuilding and the papers that are written about it and the lack thereof, or the ones that at least were serious, it would be cool to see just more things written in general on bodybuilding from the philosophical side. I think this was a cool window, maybe for everyone that checks it out, that reads it, to see how even arguments are structured within this context. Because to your point, Eric, when people make that shooting, just straight from the hip reaction about like bodybuilding is a sport, is it not a sport? It's like, well, here's how one constructs an argument. Here's how one tries to evaluate it, and maybe it's a cause then for introspection within ourselves. But I want to give you the floor, Adrian, because you've been super kind, super generous. A few times where you're waiting for us to talk, I'm like, no, man, this is you. I want to. Is there anything that you want to circle back to? Anything that you want to cover? Anything you want to say about yourself? Anything you want to say about that glorious book collection? Like, the floor is yours.
I think we covered the paper pretty well. So I'm looking forward to see the reviews for the paper, what the reviewers will say if it will get rejected and have to look for a home for this paper somewhere else. But it was definitely super fun to write the paper. And I would never have thought that I would write a paper on philosophy of sports if you would have asked me 2 years ago, actually.
Same, by the way. Same thing for me.
Yeah, and I really love collaborating with scientists, and I did it a couple of times before. My lesson from this is it's always cool to go interdisciplinary. And if you look at something, get people from different disciplines interested in the same stuff, and it will be mutual beneficial every time. And I'm super happy to be here, and thanks again for the invitation, guys.
It's our absolute pleasure, and I feel the same way. I think making sure that my reasoning is sound and my logic is sound is something that you'd think it would be like always making sure that that's the case as a scientist. But I think if empirical work is sometimes too divorced from that. And it's a skill that can atrophy a little bit. And sometimes you find people making conclusions that extend beyond their data because of that atrophy of that skill, I would say. So it was a really cool thing to work with you on that and see that that's like, you got that honed to a knife. And being able to participate and work on that interdisciplinary, I found very beneficial. And it made me actually think more about the sport that I'm heavily involved with, kind of from a philosophical perspective, which I really value and cherish. So no, it's awesome. As you guys know, Kai Homer, he's the man. He's going to have a link to the preprint. And if this is way less cool than we think it is, that may be all it ever is. But hopefully we get through peer review, and I'll definitely share that when it does happen. But check out the preprint. Also check out the link to Aranosi's paper. Just want to say big thanks for coming on, Adrian.
Thank you, guys.
Unrelated, Eric, but your next post on Instagram is going to be why I'm quitting bodybuilding, just completely separate from this paper, from the discussion, everything. As Eric was constructing the argument, he's like, I have a much stronger counter argument, actually. I think I love this. It was our absolute honor, Adrian, to have you on. Maybe this is not the last time, as we said, do you even lift the philosophical question, the exploration there? And come on now. And it's always great having another member of the cult on. Speaking of which, we appreciate everyone that made it all the way to the end of an episode at the 2-hour mark. You could go ahead and leave your support by giving us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out. Typically, people give 5 stars. The average rating is 4.8. Leave it at your own discretion. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you in that next episode and insert date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you then.